Welcome back to Green Dolphin Science. Okay, skipping the formalities today, let's just get right into it. Welcome to the deep dive. We're here again to wade through the research and pull out the key stuff for you.
And today, we're looking at something pretty serious for marine life. It's about persistent organic pollutants, POPs, specifically things like PCBs and DDTs showing up in Australian dolphins.
Right, and our main source is this new scientific paper. Legacy organic pollutants are still a threat for resident dolphins of Southeast Australia. Really eye-opening stuff. Based on blubber samples they analyzed?
Yeah, so our mission, if you like, is to unpack what the study found. We want to look at the levels of these chemicals that have been banned for ages, mind you, in these dolphins, some of which are endangered, and figure out what it means for their health and, the wider environment right off the coast here.
Consider this your shortcut, basically, to understanding a really important, maybe slightly complex environmental issue impacting marine life practically in our backyard. Okay, so let's start with the basics. POPs, persistent organic pollutants, PCBs, DDTs. What are these things and why are they still a problem if they're banned?
Well, POPs is the general term. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, they were used everywhere in industry, electrical gear, transformers, even in building materials.
Okay.
And DDT, that was a pesticide, a really, really common one back in the day.
And persistent is the key word there, isn't it?
Yeah.
They don't just vanish.
Exactly. That's the whole problem. They're incredibly stable. So even though Australia banned PCBs in 1975 and DDT in 1987, and they were globally listed under the Stockholm Convention in 2001, they just don't break down easily in the environment.
Get to stick around.
They stick around for a very long time. They end up everywhere. Soil, water, sediment. Ubiquitous is the word the scientists use.
How are chemicals banned back in the 70s and 80s still getting into the ocean now? That seems wild.
It does, but there are pathways. Runoff is a big one. Rain washes contaminated soil into rivers and then the sea. Old landfill sites or industrial areas can leach them. Sediments get stirred up and moved around, and believe it or not, they can even travel long distances in the atmosphere and then get deposited back down into the water.
So the ocean is like a final dumping ground, almost.
In a way, yeah. A long-term sink for these persistent chemicals.
And why dolphins? Why focus on them for tracking these pollutants?
Well, they're often called sentinels or canaries in the coal mine for the ocean. Marine mammals, especially top predators like dolphins, are really vulnerable.
Why them specifically?
It's down to two key processes: bioaccumulation and biomagnification.
Okay.
Bioaccumulation means the chemical builds up in one animal's body over its life, just keeps adding up.
Right.
Biomagnification is how it gets worse as you go up the food chain. So small critters absorb a bit, fish eat lots of those critters, then dolphins eat lots of those fish.
And the concentration gets higher at each step.
Exactly. It magnifies. So the dolphin at the top ends up with a much, much higher load of these chemicals than anything lower down.
And these aren't just harmless passengers in their bodies, right? The paper links them to health issues.
Oh, absolutely. The source is clear on this. High PCB levels. They're linked to things like weakened immune systems, making them prone to disease anemia, thyroid problems, possibly even cancer.
At DDT.
DDTs are nasty too, associated with problems in reproduction, development, and messing with their hormones. These aren't minor things. They can seriously impact whether an animal survives or can even have young.
Okay, let's dive into this specific study then. They looked at blubber samples from stranded dolphins.
That's right. They analyzed blubber from 36 dolphins that stranded along the Victorian coast, collected over quite a long period, 2002 to 2022.
Which species were involved?
A mix. They had the Burrunan dolphin, which is critically endangered and found in specific spots there. Also common bottlenose, short-beaked common dolphins, and a few others that weren't identified right down to species.
And the locations.
Mainly Gippsland Lakes, Port Phillip Bay, and Western Port Bay. Key habitats for these resident dolphin populations.
Now, the paper mentions a limitation, the fact these were stranded animals. How does that affect what we can conclude?
Yeah, that's important context. The researchers point out that stranded animals might already be sick or weak. Their poor health could even be why they stranded.
So they might not represent the average healthy dolphin swimming out there.
Potentially, yes. They could represent a more compromised group, perhaps with higher contaminant levels because they were unwell. But, and this is crucial, studying them is still incredibly valuable.
Why is that?
Because it shows us the levels these chemicals can reach in the population. It reveals the potential risks these animals face. It's vital data, even with that caveat. We wouldn't easily get this from healthy, free-swimming animals.
Okay, so what was the headline finding when they tested these samples?
Well, it's pretty stark, actually. PCBs and DDTs and DDE, which is the main breakdown product of DDT, they were found in every single dolphin tested.
Every single one.
Okay.
100%.
100%. Across all species, all locations over that whole time period. And often, the levels weren't just detectable, they were extremely high.
Wow. Just finding them in every sample. That really drives home how widespread these banned chemicals still are. Can you give us a sense of just how high the levels were, some of the numbers?
Yeah, let's get into the specifics. They measured concentrations as ADDT. That's the sum of DDT and its related forms, and 9 PCBs, the sum of 9 key PCB types. It's measured in nanograms per gram of lipid weight, basically how much chemical is in the fat. And generally, they found ADDT levels were higher than 9 PCBs in most dolphins.
Okay, what were some of the peak DDT levels?
Get this. The highest DDT was a massive 598,000 nanograms per gram lipid weight. That was in a male Burrunan dolphin from Port Phillip Bay.
598,000.
Yep. And another one, a juvenile from Western Port Bay, had 318,000. The paper explicitly states these levels are, and I quote, comparable to dolphins in heavily contaminated areas globally.
Heavily contaminated areas globally, but found right here off Victoria. It's sobering. What about the PCBs?
Also very high in some cases. That same juvenile from Western Port Bay, it had the highest 9 PCB level, 837,000 ALW.
Whoa. Even higher than the DDT in that case.
In that individual, yes. And Port Phillip Bay Burrunan dolphins also had very high PCB levels, up to 393,000 ALW. Again, the study notes these PCB concentrations are notable on a global scale.
It really puts things in perspective. These aren't just trace amounts. They're major contamination levels comparable to known global hotspots.
And digging into the DDT results a bit more, something interesting was the dominance of DDE. The average ratio of DDE to the total DDT measured was high, about 0.85.
And what does that tell us, that high DDE ratio?
It generally points towards historical exposure. See, DDE is what DDT breaks down into over time, and it's very stable. So a high ratio like that suggests the dolphins are mostly picking up the legacy of old DDT use from the environment, rather than being exposed to fresh inputs of the original DDT chemical itself.
So even though it was banned more than 30 years back, the study basically confirms its residue is still circulating and getting into these animals. The paper says it persists across the entire data set.
Absolutely. The persistence is crystal clear from these findings. They did note some complex patterns, though, suggesting it's not just simple breakdown. Things like the dolphin's own metabolism and diet influence how much they retain.
Okay, let's switch to the PCBs. Did they find specific types, specific congeners were more common than others?
They did. The hexachlorinated ones, PCBs, with 6 chlorine atoms, like PCB 138, Nangash 153, and Nangash 156. These were the most dominant types found, which is pretty consistent with what's seen in marine mammals and other parts of the world, too.
And does the dominance of those specific PCBs suggest anything about the source?
Well, those particular types are known to be more resistant to being broken down by the animal's body. The study suggests their prevalence might indicate exposure linked to local, potentially more recent inputs.
More recent, even with the ban back in 75.
Yeah, it sounds contradictory, but think about it. The import and new use was banned, but you still have old electrical equipment in storage or landfills, old building materials being demolished, contaminated industrial sites, maybe even some effluent discharge. These legacy sources can still leak PCBs into the environment today.
So hotspots of older contamination still releasing chemicals.
That seems plausible based on the PCB patterns, yes. They also looked at trends over time, from 2002 to 2021. There was some good news, a bit of a decline in PCBs for Burrunan and common bottlenose dolphins in Port Phillip Bay, but for dolphins in Gippsland Lakes, minimal change. So a mixed picture there.
What about differences between the dolphins themselves? Did age or sex make a difference to the contamination levels?
Yes, those factors often play a role, and the study looked into it where they had enough data, like for the Gippsland Lakes Burrunan dolphins. Generally, in marine mammals, males tend to end up with higher levels than females.
Why that?
Females have a way to offload some of their burden through pregnancy, and especially lactation. They pass a significant chunk of these fat-loving chemicals to their calves in their milk.
So reproduction kind of cleans out the mother a bit, but passes the problem to the next generation.
Essentially, yes. It's a major route of transfer. Also, adults usually have higher levels than juveniles just because they've had more time to accumulate the chemicals over their longer lives.
But hang on, you mentioned earlier those extremely high levels in some juveniles. That seems to go against the age trend.
It does, and it's a really striking finding the paper highlights. Those incredibly high levels, particularly in that western Port Bay juvenile and some from Port Phillip Bay, it strongly suggests massive maternal transfer.
Meaning the mother must have been carrying a huge load herself.
Exactly. A heavily burdened mother can pass down an enormous dose, especially to her first calf. It's sometimes called the firstborn calf effect. The first lactation transfers the biggest proportion. And the study authors explicitly say these extreme levels in the juveniles may have contributed to the death in these animals.
Wow, that's deeply concerning. The chemical legacy potentially being lethal for newborns.
It really highlights how long-lasting and severe this issue is. Another factor they considered was body condition. Remember, these POPs are stored in blubber, in fat.
Right.
Well, these stranded dolphins generally had low body fat. Their blubber lipid content was only 13 to 50%, whereas healthy dolphins are typically over 79% lipid.
Okay, so if they're sick or starving, they're burning through their fat reserves.
Exactly. And when they metabolize that blubber, the POPs stored there get released back into their bloodstream and can travel to vital organs. This mobilization can actually increase the toxic effects.
So being in poor condition makes the stored poisons more dangerous.
It certainly looks that way. For the Port Phillip Bay dolphins, they found a direct correlation. Lower body fat content was linked to higher POP concentrations in the remaining tissue. It suggests poor health can really exacerbate the toxicity.
Okay, pulling all this together, the chemicals are everywhere, the concentrations are sky high in some cases, juveniles can get massive doses from their mothers, poor health makes it worse.
Yeah.
What's the bottom line? What does this actually mean for the dolphins' chances of survival?
Yeah, this is the crucial so what question. The researchers compared the concentrations they found against known health thresholds levels documented in other studies to cause negative health effects in marine mammals.
And what did they find?
The results are worrying. Many of the dolphins studied exceeded at least one health-related threshold.
How many are we talking about? Like a few outliers?
No, not just a few. Across all the species they looked at, 23 out of the 36 dolphins, that's 64%, nearly two-thirds had POP levels above thresholds known to cause harm.
Two-thirds, okay. And what about the Burrunan dolphins? Given they're critically endangered, that must be a major concern.
It's particularly alarming for them. For the Burrunan dolphins, an incredible 89%, 17 out of the 19 individuals tested, exceeded those health thresholds.
89%. Wow. What kind of thresholds are we talking about?
Things like PCB levels over 1,300 Ng/Lw, which is linked to immune system damage and endocrine disruption, or DDT levels over 70,000 Ng/Lw, which is associated with reproductive failure. These aren't trivial levels. They're linked to serious biological impacts.
So it's not just speculation. It's highly probable these contaminant levels were genuinely harming the health of these animals.
That's exactly what the study concludes. They state it's plausible to interpret that a high portion of Burrunan dolphins, as well as some of the other deceased individuals, likely had their health impacted by their body burdens of POPs. They also point out they only measured 9 PCB types out of over 200 possible ones, so the total PCB risk might be even higher than reported.
And wasn't there mention of other contaminants found in these same dolphins previously?
Yes, that's another layer of concern. Previous work on these exact dolphin populations has also found high levels of other pollutants, like PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals, and heavy metals like mercury.
So a cocktail effect.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
The researchers specifically highlight the worry about the combined or synergistic impacts of multiple different toxic substances all hitting these animals at once, especially for the Burrunan dolphin with its small, geographically isolated populations. This chemical pressure is a serious threat.
So the big takeaway seems unavoidable. Even though these chemicals, PCBs and DDTs, were banned decades ago, they are far from a historical problem. They're an active, ongoing threat.
Absolutely. The study hammers this home. Finding such high concentrations, even in animals stranded as recently as 2022, shows these pollutants are still bioavailable, still cycling in the environment and getting into the food web. They are causing significant physiological impacts, and this really underscores the need for ongoing monitoring. We can't just assume the problem went away with the bans.
It's clear they're a persistent threat, just like their name suggests. So recapping this deep dive, we've seen compelling evidence that banned legacy pollutants, PCBs and DDTs, are still found at alarmingly high levels in dolphins off the coast of Southeast Australia.
Found in all dolphins tested, and at concentrations exceeding health thresholds in a majority of them, especially the critically endangered Burrunan dolphins.
Levels likely impacting their immune systems, reproduction, and overall health, potentially even contributing to the deaths of stranded animals, particularly vulnerable young ones.
It's a stark reminder of the incredible persistence of these chemicals and the long shadow they cast over marine ecosystems, demanding continued attention and research.
And maybe here's a final thought for you to take away. If chemicals we banned 30, 40, nearly 50 years ago are still present at levels capable of causing such serious harm to top predators today, what does that imply about the chemicals we're introducing into the environment now? What will their legacy look like decades down the track? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into legacy pollutants and the health of our oceans.